Three chilling tales from Craigslist. A babysitting job with haunting consequences, an antique mirror that hides a dark secret, and a rental house with a basement door that should never be opened. Are you ready to uncover the horrors lurking in the ordinary? Let's begin. When Alice stumbled upon the ad on Craigslist, it seemed like the perfect opportunity. Babysitter wanted. No experience necessary. $500 for one night. She was broke and desperate, and the idea of earning $500 in one evening sounded too good to pass up. The ad was vague, no names, no details about the child. But when Alice called the number listed, a calm, professional-sounding man answered. His voice was soothing, and his instructions were simple. Show up at the address at 6 p.m. The child will already be asleep. You won't need to do much. Just make sure the house stays quiet. Alice agreed, though the lack of detail nagged at her. The house was enormous, sitting alone on the edge of a dense forest. When Alice arrived, the man greeted her at the door. He was tall, dressed in an impeccably clean suit, and his expression was so neutral it unsettled her. Thank you for coming. My daughter is upstairs. Please don't disturb her. If you need anything, there's food in the fridge. Before Alice could ask any questions, he handed her an envelope with $500 in cash and left without another word. The house was eerily quiet. The air felt heavy, as if the walls were holding their breath. Alice settled on the couch and turned on the TV, trying to ignore the unease creeping over her. It wasn't long before she started hearing noises. At first it was faint, a soft creak, like someone shifting their weight upstairs. She assumed it was the child and decided to check. As she climbed the stairs, the air grew colder, and the sense of unease turned to dread. When she reached the top, she found the door to the child's room ajar. Inside, the room was immaculate, too perfect, like a dollhouse. The bed was neatly made, but there was no child. That's when she heard the whisper. It was coming from behind her. Alice spun around, but the hallway was empty. She was about to go back downstairs when she noticed something on the wall. A picture frame hung crookedly. The glass cracked. She leaned in to straighten it and froze. The photograph wasn't a family portrait. It was a picture of her, taken from outside her apartment window, staring directly into the camera. Alice's heart raced as the whispers grew louder, coming from every direction. The lights flickered, and the shadows on the walls seemed to move. She bolted down the stairs, but when she reached the front door, it wouldn't budge. The whispers turned into screams, deafening and desperate. Alice clamped her hands over her ears and ran into the living room, only to find the man from the ad sitting calmly on the couch. "I told you not to disturb her," he said, his voice unnervingly calm. Before Alice could respond, she felt something icy grip her ankle. She looked down and saw a small, pale hand reaching out from under the couch. The last thing she heard was the man's voice, cold and devoid of emotion. "You shouldn't have come." The house was found empty the next day. The ad was reposted that evening. Alice had always been a practical person. She didn't believe in ghosts, curses, or anything that couldn't be explained by science. But practicality didn't pay the bills, and right now, Alice was desperate. Her rent was overdue, her fridge was empty, and her part-time job at the diner barely covered her bus fare. So when she stumbled upon the ad on Craigslist, she didn't think twice. The house was enormous, a Victorian-style mansion with towering gables and a wraparound porch. It looked like something out of a Gothic novel, complete with ivy creeping up the walls and a wrought-iron gate that creaked ominously as she pushed it open. The man who answered the door was tall and impeccably dressed in a tailored suit. His face was unreadable, his expression so neutral it was almost unsettling. He introduced himself as Mr. Blackwood, though he offered no first name. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that made Alice's skin crawl. She settled on the couch in the living room, trying to ignore the unease creeping over her. The TV was on, but the volume was so low she could barely hear it. She flipped through channels, but every show seemed to blur together, the images flickering like a bad signal. It wasn't long before she started hearing noises. At first it was faint, a soft creak like someone shifting their weight upstairs. She assumed it was the child and decided to check. As she climbed the stairs, the air grew colder and the sense of unease turned to dread. When she reached the top, she found the door to the child's room ajar. Inside, the room was immaculate, too perfect, like a dollhouse. The bed was neatly made, but there was no child. That's when she heard the whisper. It was coming from behind her. Alice spun around, but the hallway was empty. She was about to go back downstairs when she noticed something on the wall. A picture frame hung crookedly, the glass cracked. She leaned in to straighten it and froze. The photograph wasn't a family portrait. It was a picture of her, taken from outside her apartment window, staring directly into the camera. Alice's heart raced as the whispers grew louder, coming from every direction. They weren't words exactly, more like fragments of sentences, overlapping and blending together. She couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was unmistakable. It was desperate, almost pleading. The lights flickered, and the shadows on the walls seemed to move. Alice bolted down the stairs, but when she reached the front door, it wouldn't budge. She yanked at the handle, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. But the door was locked. The whispers turned into screams, deafening and desperate. Alice clamped her hands over her ears and ran into the living room, only to find Mr. Blackwood sitting calmly on the couch. "I told you not to disturb her," he said, his voice unnervingly calm. Before Alice could respond, she felt something icy grip her ankle. She looked down and saw a small, pale hand reaching out from under the couch. The last thing she heard was Mr. Blackwood's voice, cold and devoid of emotion. "You shouldn't have come." The house was found empty the next day. The police searched every room, but there was no sign of Alice or anyone else. The furniture was covered in dust, as if no one had lived there for years. The only clue was the envelope on the coffee table, still containing $500 in cash. The ad was reposted that evening. What Alice didn't know was that she wasn't the first. Over the years, dozens of babysitters had answered the ad, each one lured by the promise of easy money. None of them had ever been seen again. The house had a history, one that Mr. Blackwood had carefully concealed. Decades ago, it had been the site of a tragic accident. A young girl had died in the house, her spirit trapped within its walls. Mr. Blackwood, her father, had made a deal with something dark to keep her with him. But the deal came with a price. Every year, he had to offer a new soul to the house. Alice had been the latest offering. The ad is still up, waiting for the next desperate soul to answer. The house is always hungry, and Mr. Blackwood is always willing to pay. So, if you ever see an ad for a babysitting job that seems too good to be true, remember Alice. And remember, some doors are better left unopened. The horrors of the babysitting job linger, but Craigslist has many more secrets to uncover. Up next is a story about an antique mirror, beautiful, timeless, and hiding something far darker than its reflection. Megan loved the thrill of thrifting. To her, each item she found was a piece of history, a hidden gem waiting to be discovered. Craigslist had become her go-to source for treasures, and when she stumbled upon the listing for an antique mirror, she couldn't resist. The mirror was described as a family heirloom in need of a new home, and the seller was asking only $50. From the photo, Megan could tell it was a stunning piece. Its ornate, gilded frame intricately detailed with floral designs, and the glass polished to a shine so reflective it almost seemed liquid. "This is it," she thought, picturing how perfectly it would fit in her bedroom. The house she arrived at was old and slightly run down, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood that felt frozen in time. The door creaked open before Megan could knock, and an elderly woman stood in the frame. "You're here for the mirror?" the woman asked. Megan nodded, offering a polite smile. The woman stepped aside, motioning for her to enter. The mirror was propped against the wall in the living room, even more beautiful in person. The gilded frame caught the light, shimmering like gold, and the glass seemed impossibly smooth, like a pool of still water. "It's a beautiful piece," the woman said, her voice soft but firm. "But it's time for it to move on." Her words were odd, but Megan brushed it off. "I'll take good care of it," Megan promised. The woman's lips curved into a faint smile, but her eyes remained somber. That's what they all say. Once Megan got the mirror home, she immediately hung it on the wall opposite her bed. It transformed the room, making the space feel larger, almost enchanting. She couldn't stop admiring it. That night, Megan climbed into bed, exhausted from the day's errands. She fell asleep quickly, but her rest didn't last. In the middle of the night, she woke to a faint tapping sound. Groggy, she glanced toward the window, assuming it was a branch brushing against the glass. But as her mind cleared, she realized the sound wasn't coming from the window. It was coming from the mirror. The tapping grew louder, more deliberate. Megan sat up, her heart pounding. She reached over to turn on her bedside lamp, casting the room in a warm glow. Her eyes darted to the mirror. Her reflection stared back, but something was wrong. She raised her hand to rub her eyes, but her reflection didn't follow. Megan froze, a cold dread settling over her. The reflection continued to stare, its head tilting slightly to one side, and then it smiled. It wasn't a natural smile. It was too wide, too sharp, stretching far beyond what was humanly possible. Before Megan could scream, her reflection turned and walked out of the frame, disappearing into the depths of the mirror. She grabbed a blanket and threw it over the glass, her hands trembling. The tapping didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, as though something on the other side was trying to get out. The next morning, Megan was determined to rid herself of the mirror. She posted an ad on Craigslist. "Antique mirror, free to a good home." Within hours, a man responded, eager to pick it up. Megan didn't ask any questions. She helped him load the mirror into his van, feeling a wave of relief as he drove away. That night, she slept soundly, convinced the ordeal was over. But when she woke the next morning, the mirror was back. It hung on the wall as if it had never left, the blanket she'd thrown over it gone. Megan's breath caught in her throat as she noticed the words scratched into the glass. The tapping began again that night, louder and angrier than before. Megan turned on every light in the house, but it didn't help. Her reflection was waiting in the mirror, its grin wider, its eyes gleaming with malice. This time, it didn't just move. It pressed its hands against the glass, pushing as though trying to break through. Panicking, Megan grabbed a hammer from the kitchen and swung it at the mirror with all her strength. The glass didn't shatter. Instead, it cracked, forming a jagged spiderweb pattern across the surface. Blood seeped from the cracks, thick and dark, pooling onto the floor. Megan stumbled back, her hands shaking. The tapping stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. When Megan woke the next morning, the mirror was gone. In its place was a single photograph, placed neatly on her bedside table. The photo was of Megan, standing in front of the mirror, smiling. But it wasn't her normal smile. It was the same unnatural grin her reflection had worn, wide and menacing, as though something else was using her face. She burned the photograph and left the house, refusing to return. But wherever she went, she couldn't escape the feeling that she was being watched. At night, when she passed a reflective surface, she would catch glimpses of her own face. But it wasn't quite her. It was smiling. Megan tried to move on, but the mirror's presence lingered. She avoided looking at her reflection, covering mirrors and turning off screens that might show her face. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape it. One night, as she lay in bed, she heard the tapping again. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, more insistent. She sat up, her heart racing, and looked toward the wall where the mirror had once hung. It was back. The mirror hung in its usual spot, the cracks in the glass still visible, the bloodstains dried and dark. Her reflection stared back at her, its grin wider than ever, its eyes filled with a malevolent glee. Megan tried to scream, but no sound came out. She tried to move, but her body refused to obey. The reflection stepped forward, pressing its hands against the glass. The cracks began to widen, the blood flowing freely once more. And then, with a sound like shattering glass, the reflection stepped out of the mirror. Megan's last thought was that it wasn't her reflection anymore. It was something else entirely. The next morning, the mirror was gone again. In its place was a new photograph, placed neatly on the bedside table. The photo was of Megan, standing in front of the mirror, her face frozen in a wide, unnatural grin, but this time, her eyes were empty. And in the background, barely visible in the reflection, was something else. A shadowy figure, its grin even wider, its eyes gleaming with triumph. The mirror was gone, but its curse remained, and Megan was no longer herself. The mirror appeared in another home the next day, listed on Craigslist as a family heirloom in need of a new home. The cycle continued, and somewhere, deep within the mirror, Megan's reflection smiled. The antique mirror's chilling tale leaves us with one truth. Some things are better left untouched, but Craigslist's eerie offerings don't end there. Our next story takes us to an old rental house, where curiosity about a locked basement unleashes something unimaginable. Jack had always been the curious type. Whether it was a mysterious noise in the attic or an abandoned building at the end of the block, he couldn't resist exploring the unknown. So, when he stumbled across a Craigslist ad for a cheap rental house with a cryptic description, "Quaint home with character, minor repairs needed," he jumped at the opportunity. The house was as advertised, old, creaky, and steeped in the faint scent of mildew. Its charm lay in its vintage details, ornate banisters, stained glass windows, and a clawfoot tub in the bathroom. For the price, Jack considered it a steal. The landlord was a jittery man in his 50s, his nervous energy palpable as he handed over the keys. "It's a good house," the man said, avoiding Jack's eyes. "But there's one thing. Don't go in the basement." Jack frowned. "Why not?" "It's not safe," the landlord replied, his tone final. "Just don't." Jack agreed, more out of politeness than intention. He couldn't deny that the warning only made him more intrigued. For the first few weeks, Jack settled into the house without incident. He patched a few cracks in the walls, replaced a squeaky cabinet hinge, and even started decorating. But despite his best efforts, the house had an uncanny way of reminding him that it was far from ordinary. Items he was certain he had left on the counter would vanish, only to reappear in odd places. A coffee mug on the stairs, a book in the bathroom sink. The floorboards groaned at night, as though someone unseen was pacing the halls. And then there were the whispers. They started faint, barely audible, like the distant murmur of a conversation just out of earshot. But as the nights wore on, they grew louder, more distinct. They always came from the same place, the basement. Jack tried to ignore it. He kept the basement door locked and told himself it was just the house settling, or perhaps an overactive imagination. But deep down, he knew better. One evening, after a particularly loud series of creaks and whispers, Jack decided he couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing a flashlight, he approached the basement door, his heart pounding in his chest. The lock was old and rusty, but it gave way with a sharp crack. The door swung open, revealing a set of rickety wooden stairs descending into darkness. Jack hesitated, then stepped down, the flashlight casting long, jagged shadows on the stone walls. The air in the basement was thick, heavy with a damp, earthy smell. The space was nearly empty, save for a single wooden chest in the center of the room. The chest was old and battered, its surface covered in intricate carvings, strange, looping symbols that Jack didn't recognize. As he approached, the whispers grew louder, swirling around him like a cyclone of disembodied voices. He crouched in front of the chest, his hands trembling as he lifted the lid. Inside there was nothing but a pile of black, withered feathers. They looked ancient, brittle, as if they would crumble to dust at the slightest touch. Jack's flashlight flickered. Suddenly, the basement door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The whispers turned to screams, guttural and inhuman, echoing off the stone walls. Jack stumbled back, his flashlight flickering erratically, casting the basement in bursts of light and shadow. The walls began to shift, dark shapes crawling across them, shadows that moved independently of the light. They stretched and contorted, forming grotesque, human-like figures with elongated limbs and hollow eyes. The chest shuddered violently. Before Jack could react, it flung itself open, the lid slamming against the floor. From inside, something began to crawl out, a mass of black feathers, gleaming eyes, and razor-sharp claws. The creature dragged itself toward Jack, its body writhing and shifting like a living nightmare. Its whispers filled his head, incoherent yet deafening, as though it was speaking directly into his mind. Jack screamed, stumbling backward. The last thing he saw was the creature lunging at him, its eyes glowing with malevolent hunger. When Jack woke, he was in his bed, drenched in sweat. The house was silent, the basement door locked and untouched. For a moment he wondered if it had all been a dream, but when he sat up, he noticed something on his nightstand. A single black feather, brittle and sharp, resting atop the keys to the basement. Jack wasted no time packing his belongings. By the end of the day, he had moved out without so much as a goodbye to the landlord. A week later, while browsing Craigslist for a new place to stay, he stumbled across a familiar listing. Quaint home with character, minor repairs needed. Do not open the basement door. Double asterisk. Jack stared at the screen, his blood running cold. He could still hear the whispers at the edge of his mind, faint but unrelenting, as though they were waiting for him to come back. He closed his laptop and swore he'd never look back. But at night, in the silence of his new apartment, he sometimes heard a faint knock, soft and persistent, echoing from the walls. And when he turned on the lights, he would find a single black feather lying on the floor. Jack tried to convince himself that the feather was a coincidence, that the whispers were just his imagination running wild. But deep down, he knew better. The creature from the basement wasn't done with him. The knocks grew louder, more frequent, until they became impossible to ignore. One night, Jack woke to the sound of something scratching at his bedroom door. He sat up, his heart pounding, and stared at the door, half expecting it to burst open. But nothing happened. The scratching stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Jack hesitated, then got out of bed and approached the door. He opened it slowly, peering into the hallway. The hallway was empty, but the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. Jack's stomach churned as he noticed something on the floor, a trail of black feathers leading from his door to the living room. He followed the trail, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The feathers led him to the living room window, where they stopped abruptly. Jack looked out the window, his breath catching in his throat. Standing in the street below was the creature from the basement. Its body was a mass of shifting shadows and feathers, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. It stared up at Jack, its grin wide and unnatural, as though it had been waiting for him. Jack slammed the window shut and backed away, his heart racing. He grabbed his phone and dialed the landlord's number, but the call went straight to voicemail. "You can't escape me," a voice whispered in his ear. Jack spun around, but the room was empty. The whispers grew louder, filling his head until he could barely think. He stumbled into the kitchen, his hands trembling as he fumbled for a knife. But when he turned around, the creature was standing in the doorway. Its grin widened as it stepped toward him, its claws scraping against the floor. Jack swung the knife, but it passed through the creature as though it were made of smoke. The creature lunged at him, its claws sinking into his chest. Jack screamed, but no sound came out. When Jack woke, he was in his bed, drenched in sweat. The house was silent, the whispers gone. For a moment, he thought it had all been a nightmare. But when he sat up, he noticed something on his nightstand. A single black feather, brittle and sharp, resting atop the keys to the basement. And on the wall above his bed, written in jagged, blood-red letters, were the words, "You're mine now." Jack didn't bother packing this time. He grabbed his keys and ran out the door, leaving everything behind. But no matter how far he ran, he couldn't escape the whispers. They followed him wherever he went, faint but unrelenting, as though the creature was always just a step behind. And at night, when he closed his eyes, he could still see its grin, wide and unnatural, waiting for him in the darkness. The house was listed again the next day, the ad unchanged. Quaint home with character, minor repairs needed. Do not open the basement door. And somewhere, deep within the basement, the creature waited for its next victim.